Hi, this is Vanessa Kuto, and today for this video, we're going to explore Mars archetype in our culture, a little bit of its background, and how we can honor it in our lives. So as I've said, I'm Vanessa Kuto. I'm an astrologer, a life purpose coach, and the intention with this video is to explore the Mars archetype and how we can honor it in our lives. Because as we look to the world and what's unfolding, there's a lot of Martian energy out there. There's an agitation, there's frustration, there are wars. There are so many manifestations of a negative Mars. And my view on how we can work with the archetypes within astrology or mythically is to try to see how these archetypes, in this case Mars, inhabits our own lives. How do we deal with it? Our own anger, frustration, violence, but also courage and determination. So this is the intention of this video. Also, in terms of timing, right now, at the time of this recording, it's February 2024. Next week on Valentine's Day, February 24, Mars is going to arrive in Aquarius and join Pluto. So there's a bit of that in the air that is catching my attention. And then at the end of the year, we're going to have a Mars retrograde starting in December. So there's this kind of Martian energy already, and I thought it would be a good time to reflect on how can we best work with Mars in our own lives. So the idea here is that when we don't understand the relationship to the principle, let's say in this case Mars, we can fall victim to its more negative manifestations, right? So as Edward Edinger said, unless we have relation to the principle, we will fall victim to its negative manifestation. If we are not willing to fight when required, if we cannot summon up aggressive energy when it is appropriate, we will succumb to it in some other way. So while it might be easy for us to blame others out there for their violence and their frustration, they are doing the madness. I think it's important with this quote here is that we look to how does Mars, in this case, this aggression, show up in our own lives, in our inner world? Otherwise, we may fall victim to its unconscious manifestation. So here's a little bit of a general overview of Mars from an astrology perspective. So Mars in the chart represents our self-assertion, our drive, our courage, our vigor, our sexual drive, how we approach sexuality, how we engage in the sexual act. But it's also about our ability to recuperate. It's also how do we compete? What's our style of competition, both either biological or psychological? And it also has a lot to say about our survival instincts and our dynamic energy. So there's a lot that Mars does for us. In some ways as well, you can call Mars the henchman of the sun, meaning the sun beams, the sun wants to be expressed, but Mars helps it give it power and sort of that sense of individuality. It's going to go do what the sun wants to do, right? It's going to go out there. It's the muscle. It also describes how we stand up for something. How do we assert ourselves? Also, how do we defend ourselves? And it's where we see red, right? When Mars is activated in our lives, that's the moment, right? That we see, how do we approach that anger? How do we express it? And Mars, much like the sun, needs to be expressed. It has a strong link to our ego, and it wants to be externalized. It needs to feel that its accomplishment is going to be pushed outward, right? Much like the solar energy. And it is kind of the carrier of the energy of the sun, also Mercury, as well as Venus out into the world, right? So if the sun wants to express itself, if it's Mercury wants to, if you will, communicate, and if Venus has a desire, it's Mars that goes out there and gets it. And also kind of like the sun, Mars requires us, even demands that it's recognized, because it helps us to separate ourselves from the collective mass and to demonstrate our individuality. And I think this is an important point to highlight with all this force of Aquarius, in the sense that now Pluto has arrived in Aquarius, where it's going to be for 20 years. I mean, other than a little bit of a dip towards the end of the year back in Capricorn, and then really back into Aquarius for 20 years. So there's a strong emphasis in Aquarius. Back in the end of 2020, we also had the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. So there's, in the last 3 to 4 years, we've been having this real strong emphasis of Aquarius. And one of the things about Aquarius is that, yes, we are a collective, but it's how we bring our individuality into the collective. And that's why I kind of felt inspired to talk about Mars, because if we don't understand our own Mars, how can we then be within the group, within the community? How can we demonstrate our individuality? And it's also, Mars really kind of clarifies our capacity to know what we want and what do we need to do to go get it, right? It gives us that oomph to go after what we desire. And so that's an important element in these days, because with such collective confusion, we can get lost. And it's important to know, what is it that we want? How do we separate what is really necessary, what we really desire, from the confusion of the collective? And then how do we engage and go in doing it? So as the astrologer Robert Hand said, nothing exists in nature without the energy of Mars enabling it to survive. So if we're going to survive in anything, how are we even going to fight with our immune system? Mars is also linked to our immune system. Then we need the energy of Mars. So these times, in this courageous decade, as I like to call it, we need Mars. We need to really understand our Mars principle. And this quote from Claire Martin, the astrologer, I love what she says here, that Mars can be immensely effective or immensely destructive. If the energy of Mars is blocked, it doesn't simply go away, but turns back on the individual, back onto ourselves, which means that we will attract and invite violence into our lives from the outside world. This blocked energy can also have serious physical effects, resulting in various illnesses or in depressions, which are caused by the suppression of anger. We must find an outer channel for this energy. And so here you see that when our own Mars, due to whatever reason, is blocked, it doesn't just go away. That anger doesn't go away. That frustration doesn't go away. It turns back onto ourselves and can give us physical illnesses. One of the signs is, let's say, inflammation, all the sort of illnesses that are related to inflammation. And in terms of psychology, it can actually lead to depression as well. The suppression of something for too long makes us spend a lot of energy suppressing it, thus the depressive state. So we must find a way to channel our Mars in the world in a more constructive way, in a more effective way. And this is sort of the focus of this video today. So let's go back a little bit to some of the mythic origins of Mars, the many faces of Mars. And here we can see an evolution of a principle, right? We can see how it goes from back to the Mesopotamian times, when Mars was called Nergal, the Lord of the Dead, which was originally a solar deity, but considered evil because he was lord of both fires of hell and the heat of fierce summers. So for the Mesopotamians, he was the god of death, the god of war, and destruction. So from really early on, you can see Mars is already linked to war and destruction. He was also the husband of the underworld goddess, the queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, and it was a very tumultuous romance, if we can call it a romance. That made him the god of the grave and the judge of the dead. So here you can see back in those early origins, Mars had more of an underworld tone to it, even though it was originally a solar deity. He was also linked to the widespread of disease or carnage, considered to be the god of the plague, fevers. So here's the association with immune system, heat that we still have, pestilence, and of course, god of war and lord of battle. He was also linked to the idea of what they call the bed of warriors, meaning the plague of the dead. That's when armies were struck down by plague or carnage. So as you can see here, there's a lot of gore related to Mars. And to top it off, he was the ruler of butchers and slaughterhouses. So that's a very bloody origin of this archetype. So then when we move to the Greeks, we start seeing a shift, still needing a better PR, but there's a shift. Again, for the Greeks, he was the god of war, Ares, strife, and fighting. He was already the principle of aggression. Depending on what version you read, because mythology is a search of many versions, and they're not all sort of similar, but oftentimes you will read that Ares was the son of Hera, and he was birthed only from her. He didn't have a father because out of the jealousy for over Zeus having Athena, birthed Athena through his head, Hera then births Ares. And so he already comes from a beginning of being birthed from anger and frustration and jealousy. So here we can see that Ares carries the aggressions of others, starting with his own mother, Hera. In some versions, he was despised by Zeus, not really even having a display in the Parthenon. So Zeus scorns him for being the stirrer of strife, the instigator of combat and deadly sadness. And so there's an ambivalence already with Ares. He's part of the Olympians, he's there, but he doesn't quite have a place for himself. And that shows the ambivalence towards war, which is considered the bane of humanity. His very presence, whenever he showed up, meant death, it meant wildness, and there was a lot of focus on fear and terror. But he was also considered to be necessary despite being dangerous, so he needed to be controlled in some way. But it is his famous love affair with the goddess Aphrodite, aka Venus, that transforms Ares' passion, right? So together, they have 3 children, and in some versions, they had even 4. So with him, she had Deimos, fear, Phobos, where we get the word phobic, which meant panic, and also the daughter Harmonia, meaning harmony. And in some of those other versions, also Eros, the Cupid. So they had 3 to 4 children. So you can see that even in the children, there's already a mixed bag of elements that comes from the union of Mars and Venus, or aka Ares and Aphrodite. Now, one thing that stood out to me in looking at him from the Greek perspective is that it is mentioned that he was taught to dance first before he learned how to fight. And I think here's an interesting sort of side note, but that we may keep bring to our attention, the need to dance first before we can fight. Maybe this is the focus that we need to bring in our lives. How do we dance, literally or metaphorically? So then comes the Romans, which I would say they gave Mars a pretty big rebrand. That was a very extensive rebrand of Mars. So to the Romans, Mars was considered the founding father of Rome. Rome is the city of Mars. And so he becomes a key piece in the Roman imperial machine. He's also connected to the Roman emperor, and he was called Mars Augustus. Now, here in Rome, he's not just linked to war. This is where he gets an expansion. He gets, if you will, more market share. He also becomes the god related to agriculture, prosperity, fertility, of course, war. But war here as a way to bring stability, which is the idea of the Pax Romana, which wasn't just doing war for war's sake, but it was using war as quote unquote peacemaker. And if you know a little bit of Roman history, you know that the Romans were very violent and they would subdue other peoples through violence, but there was something, if you will, civilizing in their strange way of spreading their empire. There were also Mars festivals, which you can call it anything that involved animals and gladiators being slaughtered, right? Gladiators being quite sort of another way of seeing the Mars archetype. The month of March is his month. That's why it's called March. And was often the beginning of the war campaigns. You know, if you think about a March in Europe, this would be the beginning of springtime, so when you could start your war campaigns. And even the word martyrs, the word comes from a sacrifice to Mars. So it's interesting if you think about the concept of a martyr, if you take away the religious connotations of it, but if you call someone a martyr, it is kind of a way to, it's kind of like Mars inverted, right? Instead of going out and expressing itself outward, it turns inward and one sacrifices oneself, right? There's your origin. Then, of course, even Christian Rome co-opted Mars, bringing forth the idea of war being sanctioned by God. And this apparently has roots in St. Augustine, using war to make peace. And you can think further ahead with the Crusades, the Holy War, and often being, the soldiers going on crusades calling themselves Mars, considering Mars a son of God. So now Mars goes in, even in Christianity, gets adopted by God. So here we see with the Roman times, the idea that conflict, however it shows up, can be a way for societies to thrive. So here you can see that there's this big evolution of the archetype, right? From Lord of the Underworld to now being even related to God, being a son of God. Now let's see Mars in our current culture, right? So new clothes to this ancient archetype. So just sort of a small sample here of how Mars shows up in our culture now. So on the top left, you can see the modern gladiators of American football, the athletes. We also see Mars in our adoration of beautiful physique, especially in men, working out, muscle bound, being in the gym all hours of the day, really crafting this physique that is very sexualized as well. We also have Mars in the idea of speed with a sports car, but also Mars in road rage and traffic. And then we also have Mars in, of course, our ideals of the superhero, right? Like the Avengers or Wonder Woman, who was an Amazon. And even in ancient mythology, Amazons were the daughters of Mars. And then in the center here, we have the movie The Martian, when Matt Damon's character gets stuck in Mars, right? And he has to find ingenuity to survive, right? And also in our culture now, there's a lot of talk about going to Mars, right? Colonizing Mars, the actual planet. So Mars is very much in our imagination in many ways. Now, another way that we're unfortunately seeing Mars again and again in our culture is in war, literally war. So a few things about just the archetype of war. One, however, we see it's, as the ancient Greeks would consider it a bane of civilization, but there we have it. So war glues together each of the nations involved and produces a rebirth of national purpose and values. This is often an aspect of war that is used by politicians to promote war, right? We get all this nationalism, we're going to fight the other country, we're going to win. And so it gives the country sort of that sense of bonding together. Then nationalism can be used as a kind of civil religion, right? We only see the nation. Of course, violence and the killing gives violence and killing sort of a sacredness to it, right? So this is coming from way back with the ancients, and as we saw through Christianity, right? It is okay to kill if they are the enemy, right? So war here really, there's a deep psychological element that is seen as purifying, an aspect on the nation. Because now, during war, the enemy, whoever the enemy is, becomes the container into which we project our poison, right? So it's not us, it's them. They're the ones doing it. They're bad, they're evil. And so we project all that, but we are good, we are pure. And so this external threat brings us together and creates sort of a group solidarity, right? However, we have to understand that we are also responsible for war to the extent that if we avoid looking at the war within, if we avoid looking and acknowledging the Mars within, we are, consciously or not, probably unconscious, responsible for the war outside. So I feel that one way for us to reduce in some shape or form the strength of the archetype of war running around in the world, in however way it does, is for us to engage with the Mars within. So that kind of diminishes the vitality of the archetype of war. Because one of the interesting things is that war can produce a temporary high because it can act as an antidepressant. Remember Mars, when it's going out, it's doing its thing, it's fair enough, but when it turns inward, it can be depressive. So if you think about culturally, when we are at war, we have this high and then it's kind of like an antidepressant, which is why periodically we find new or old enemies when we go back to it again. And so here's the other thing as well, that much like the ancients, we have this ambivalence with war and also the soldiers, right? So if we look at history, we see that the attitude towards violence has still remained ambivalent. Soldiers were both admired and looked upon with contempt. War heroes receive victory parades and are then neglected and marginalized. To be consciously violent was and is considered insane, permitted only under special circumstances, kind of the idea of making war sacred. And we can also see this in the treatment of our war veterans, right? They may receive some respect, but they're often neglected, as we can see through the high numbers of suicide and addiction to alcohol and drugs once they come home. And from a psychological point of view, the affirmation of nonviolence is risky. Morality can blind us to the intricacies of our shadow. A consciousness of impurity is a prerequisite for dealing with the contents of our shadow. So what that means here is, while we may say, no, we don't want violence, it's not good, it's really bad, and this is, in many ways correct, We also have to acknowledge the intricacies, the layers of our own psychological shadow. So to preach all light and banish all shadow, it's going to create a huge imbalance, which then rises in violence, right? So we also have to be conscious of our own impurity within ourselves and within the culture, so we can work with the shadow. So then, let's say our soldiers don't have to do the work for us. We don't have to go to the extreme of a much bigger war, right? Back again to this point that if we push Mars into the jungle of our unconscious, it results in frightening energy that fuels increased violence in general. So the more we push, the more we cut out the ability of expression, because remember, Mars needs to be expressed in some way. Then if we decrease that, it goes on the ground, it sort of festers there, and then whoosh, it comes up most unexpectedly, and then violence rages. So speaking of violence, let's talk a little bit about violence, anger, and frustration. So back to this again, this idea in our culture of purity, right? So we tend to put things into the unconscious, is this kind of this fantasy that no, I'm not bad. I'm not violent. We're getting rid of the bad things, the bad parts of ourselves. So when we do that, that's when we externalize this internal conflict between the good and the bad parts of ourselves, right? That's the dichotomy. Oh no, I didn't say that thing that insulted you. You're not, you're picking that up. But if we really look on the inside, there was already an internal conflict. And so because our society is made up of individuals, so to the extent that we participate in these problems, we are all responsible for war. Unfortunately, rather than look at our own responsibility, we want to blame politicians. Now, I'm not saying that the politicians don't have, some to blame. However, the politicians are part of our community, right? They're not aliens from another world. And so we do have to look at ourselves, right? This is the challenge. I'll share this just to illustrate the principle. This was a couple of years ago, and I was frustrated by an email I received. I was kind of angry and stewing on it, and I went for a walk. And in my walk, I was walking by a couple, and they had a dog with them, and the dog looked pretty friendly, nothing, it wasn't one of those sort of more, like a German Shepherd kind of dog. It looked like a peaceful dog. But as I walked by them, the dog attacked me and bit me on my leg. And thankfully, it wasn't bad, no damage. But I remember it really stirred me, because I was like, oh my God, here I am with this internal conflict, feeling angry and unsure how to respond to that email. And then as I go for a walk, it's like the dog picked up on that vibe and attacked me. So it came from the outside, right? So it's even those little, incidents in our lives show us how can we, work with our inner Mars. So back to the idea of violence, because we tend to condemn violence in our personal lives, right? No, I'm not violent. But we do like its psychological impact, because in a strange way, kind of like a Mars thing, it resets us. It helps us free ourselves from our inhibitions and social obligations. I'm not saying that it's good to go get violent, but I think we have to understand the role of violence in our lives. So if you look at some movies, we see how many movies and TV shows are so violent. And even some movies show how when a person finally sort of breaks free and gets violent, has a fight at the bar or something, they kind of like free themselves from their inhibitions. We see this in movies that are serious and in comedies. So just to illustrate. So because our culture has banned violence, Now, I'm not saying it's not happening in public sphere and in our private lives, but we have focused it on stories. So that's probably why we have so many shows, TV shows, movies that are super violent. They're getting ever progressively more violence, almost as if it's not hitting the spot for us anymore. So we need to really go extreme. And we see it also in other areas through social media, the tabloids, gossip, that kind of secondhand violence narrative. So like the rise of the true crime podcasts. So how many people love to listen to those, watch true crime documentaries. So there's this fascination. We're kind of in this sort of fascinated. We can't look away. We desire it, but we also feel contempt for it. The other part of violence is that it takes us by surprise. It often catches us by surprise. So if you think about your own life, is how sometimes it just comes in and all of a sudden you're just exploding, right? And what's needed here is that we need to look at the beast in the eye, starting with the beast within, right? The beast, the anger within. Because violence is a chthonic energy. I mean, it's deep from the underground. It's the, underworld. Think about the origins of Mars. It came from the underworld, right? Back in Babylonian times. So there's an element to that's never really going to be civilized in the sort of Athenian, Apollonian culture, right? So it's always there disrupting. And it's how do we navigate with that? So the other thing here, I'm just emphasizing the point, this comes from Howard Sasportas, who was an astrologer, where he says, we may not be the ones committing murder and atrocity, but if we sit on anger and don't direct our innate aggression into constructive outlets, we are guilty of adding to the amount of violence and hostility accumulating in the air. If we deny or repress something in ourselves, other people will express it for us. So just really kind of summarizing this idea that you may not be externally a violent person. It doesn't have to be massive, but what is the kind of violence you're dealing with internally? It could be how you speak to yourself, the kind of inner dialogue you have with yourself, how you might be also thinking about other people in your life. We may so easily say, oh my God, this thing happened at work. I just want to kill my boss. I want to kill my coworker. All that type of language. Even though we're not going to act on it. It is an example of how we're adding to the hostility that's accumulating in the air. But it's difficult. It is very difficult because there's something, I would say, contagious as well about violence and aggression, right? Especially if we're not aware of it. So when we are very unconscious of our shadow side or the things that really trigger us in many ways, that's when the violence that's in the air, the hostility, sort of catches us. We have no immunity against it, right? It's kind of like a virus. So how can we work with this? So if the Mars energy is blocked in some way, as we know, it's going to turn on itself. So it tends to attract the very thing that perpetuates this sort of stagnant feel of frustration, right? So the more frustrated you feel, the more you get it, right? So if you've been in traffic, you probably have this experience. You're stuck in traffic, you're getting frustrating, your frustration is growing, and then it's kind of like stagnant, keeps repeating and just fueling itself. It attracts, it doesn't move out, it just keeps growing on the inside. So in moments like this, what we have to do is invoke our Venus. Remember Aphrodite, Venus, the lover of Mars. So Venus here can be what we value. What is the thing that we value? What kind of life do we want to live? How do we want to approach a situation? What kind of value do we want to walk and talk, right? So we have to remember, what does our Venus love? What does it value? That helps us then bring Mars to fight for the good things, to fight for what it really values. It sort of directs its energy more creatively, right? Because if your Mars and what it stands for, remember that Mars is, what do we stand for, right? Can illuminate how in your life or in your work you can also help others, right? So one question you can ask yourself is, what causes can I align with? What do I stand for? Where do I want to put my energy, Mars, to fight the good fight, if you will? So it's important for us to look how Mars is or isn't in our lives expressing itself. So look at your personal life, look at your professional life. Where is it kind of feeling stuck, blocked, stagnant? And then look at what kind of issues you're having. Where is it? What kind of frustration or what kind of psychological violence is being expressed with that blocked Mars? Or look and then think, how can I express my Mars, this energy, this vitality that I have, in a way that's going to feel creative for me? Back to Richard, who was an astrologer as well, where he says, aggression arises when Mars is not connected with Venus. Our values, our desire, what we love. When the bond is broken between Mars and Venus, so if that bond is broken, that's when the aggression shows up, the frustration. It's almost as if frustrations is telling us, hey, your energy is not linked to something it loves. Think about being at work or at a job that you don't like, you're not feeling fulfilled, it's not meaningful. That's when that kind of aggression, frustration shows up. But if you, let's say, are working a place where you feel fulfilled, you love, you're feeling like you're living your value, everything is fine, right? So the reverse here is also possible, that sometimes the placating Venus is so cut off from Mars, so Venus is so weakened because it's separate from Mars, that it doesn't know what it wants either. So they have to go together. Venus by itself, like disconnected from Mars, can feel a bit like, I just don't know what I want. So I work with a lot of clients around, purpose and livelihood, vocation. And it's always surprising to me when I say, what would you like to do? If money was no object. And they're often, many of them, like, I don't know. I don't know what I want. I know I'm dissatisfied, but I don't know what I want. So here is a sign that Venus has been separated from Mars as well. So it shows up in many ways. So here is that Alice O'Howell was a Jungian astrologer, and she said the ideal expression of Mars and of Venus comes when they are balanced by each other. Then Mars learns to fight for another instead of against, and Venus becomes strong love instead of weak. The result is the splendid dance of creation. So one of the key things that Venus teaches Mars is to fight for another. This is when we serve the other in some way. We're not fighting against the other. And then Venus becomes that love that is strong. There's a strong vitality to that love. It's not weak, kind of like, I don't know what I want type of love, right? So together, then they dance really well. The creation, something comes forth. Remember that Venus desires, shows us what we want, what we value, and Mars goes and get it. So they got to work together. So another part of Mars here, because when we think about Mars, we also think about the warrior, right? So, but what about the warrior ethos, right? So here's the idea of approaching Mars in a way that the ancients were thinking about it, but maybe it might be good for us to bring into our culture now. So in the dictionary, ethos is defined as moral character, nature, disposition, and customs of a people or culture. It's from the word ethos that we have also the word ethics. So the warrior ethos is a code of conduct, a conception of right and wrong, of virtues and of vices. And the warrior ethos is something that is taught. It's, in almost every culture, it is taught. It is a sort of a regimen of training and discipline. And when you're speaking of Mars, one thing about Mars that does help is discipline. If we think of the association of Mars with physique, the athlete, the body, the muscle, it has to do with the muscles. It's about that discipline, right? If you want to get in better shape, you go to the gym. There's that discipline of going to the gym. So it's important. But if you think about the warrior ethos, there is something about training and learning and improving. So this comes from the work of Stephen Pressfield. It's a short but pretty powerful little book called The Warrior Ethos that I recommend, especially when you're wanting to work with Mars in your life. So the idea is that the warrior virtue comes from courage, which is very much related to Mars, selflessness, love and loyalty, love of and loyalty to your comrades, to your friends, to your partners. And I say this because I think it's an important element going back to all this Aquarius energy, right? That we're having this emphasis on. This idea of the community, my comrade, my fellow citizen, right? It's also about patience. It's a cultivating of patience. Think of the martial artist, right? Self-command, the endurance of adversity, so you're not going so eager towards it, but you're having a sense of endurance. Sometimes it's also the idea that you do embrace adversity because it's going to give you resilience. It's going to build your psychological muscle. But it's also the idea of needing to survive. How do we survive, right? And I like this quote from Cyrus the Great. He was a Persian king in the ancient times. And he said that soft lands make soft people. And we can think about this in terms of being psychologically resilient. Mars teaches us too much softness. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have soft skills, but if you're too lax, you can become psychologically weak. And this is an element where Mars can come and help us build that resiliency, right? The warrior ethos is also about, instead of going towards fear, we go towards love, which comes together with courage, then which leads to being selflessness, right? To being able to help the other, to serve the other. It commands the brute aggression to be tampered. So see the progression of Mars. Mars, can go haywire, and it could be all that gore, right? But there is an element of being tampered, the self-restraint, to be guided by a moral principle. More Jedi, less, gladiator. So this is where the warrior ethos, a good Mars, a good functioning Mars, is that it shows us that an unjust action should not be taken, right? And how then do we apply this warrior ethos towards ourselves in looking at our own inner enemies? Inner enemies like resistance, maybe it's psychological laziness. It could be our tendencies to live inventing and complaining but not doing something about it. All those inner enemies that all of us have, we could benefit from bringing this warrior ethos towards our insides, our inner world, to see how we can transform ourselves. Because this warrior archetype lives within all of us, right? And it's the stage upon which everything else rests. Because remember, nothing in nature progresses and goes out into the world without the principle of Mars, right? You need Mars to get out of bed, right? So it's as simple as that. So it would benefit us to approach our Mars from this warrior ethos. And I really love this quote that comes from the book. If you think about the Spartans in Greek history, and the question was, why do Spartans punish with a fine a warrior who loses his helmet or spear, but punish with death the warrior who loses his shield? It's because the helmet and spear are carried for the protection of the individual alone, but the shield protects every man in the line. So the group here comes before the individual. And I think this is going to be an interesting theme that we're going to be exploring in this Aquarian age, the place of the group in the community and the individual within it, right? How do we hold our shield to protect not just us, but also the next person, the person next to us, right? How can we extend our action, our ability to do things that is not just self-serving, but can also serve the others that are close to us? Another Greek concept that I think it's really helpful when we're working with Mars is the concept of arete. So for the ancient Greeks, this term described the maximum ability and potency for action. It had to do with effectiveness. It was a skill. It was good. Think about the athlete that gets so good in doing their moves that it's so effective, right? They're able to carry the lance, the ball into where they need to go. So there's an element of arete. And if you think about Mars, it's that repetitive discipline action. And to them, arete also was sort of there was an element of character, because it's linked to what we do and how we act. And they understood that it needed to be refined, perfected in the best way. You needed a structure so that we can constantly perform better in the best possible way. That sense of improvement, right? Growing upon skill upon skill. It was also the idea of excellence as a moral virtue or worth. It was courage and strength. And these ideas of virtue, courage, strength were linked to the notion of fulfilling a purpose or function. It wasn't just empty, going nowhere. It needed a direction. And that direction could be a kind of function or a sense of purpose. So this is really important now in our world, that we need to know. That's why, I love working with life purpose coaching, because the clients I'm working with, they're coming with that question. Okay, how do I bring what I have, my talents, skills, creative juice, to apply to purpose, in a way they're gonna bring it out into the world. Arete is also linked to the idea of feeling like you're living up to your full potential, right? You're really dedicating yourself to the quest. And while you're doing that, you're being of service to the greater whole, to the community, right? So I see this very much linked to the idea of life purpose. And it's something that can be learned. It is not inherited. It is not a given. It is learned and practiced. And it's also gives us a goal, kind of a sense of where we're heading. It's like the highest quality in which we can reach, right? We get focused on that quality of how we do it and how do we experience. Some people have this very naturally, which they're always trying to really show and stand by the quality of what they do. They take pride in what they do. So there are a couple of, if you will, two levels, two groups of arete. There was the heroic arete. So this would be the warriors who are able to fight. They had the strength, they had the skill, they had that spirit of competition and pride. So that's more of a yang, Martian arete, very linked to Mars. But there was also the arete of Mors, meaning this was applied to your daily life, to your ordinary life. So this was your manners, how you showed hospitality, how much composure did you have in response to the unexpected. It was your ability to be courteous towards others. So this was, if you will, more yin Venusian arete. So a good combination is for us to look at this in our lives. So here's some ideas of how you can honor Mars and start working with your inner Mars. Is because unless we work with Mars with a practice, it can become a destroyer. It can turn against us and others, right? So think about in your own life, where does your Mars get attention and need some discipline, care? Where might your Mars be acting out like a spoiled brat, but is needing a little bit of discipline, a little bit of attention, needs to be taken to a psychological gym to work out, right? Also think about what makes you really get up in the morning. What gets you up? What jazzes you? What kind of gives you that oomph, that energy? Or another question here is, what do you feel is your heroic assignment in life? Or maybe in the job you're doing, in your today, your list of things to do today. What is the thing you need to really go do it, Think about, what are you willing to fight for, protect, and preserve in life, in your life? And what is your bull's eye that you're going for? Like, what is your desire? You got to honor, and how you're going to go after that. Not just talk about it, do something, right? I'll illustrate this with something I see a lot with clients. Often, pretty much 90% of clients will come to me and say, I want clarity. And I want clarity. So once I have clarity, I will do it. And I often say to them, but you need to actually take first steps to reach that clarity. Clarity comes from movement. So you need to engage Mars. You need to start taking those little steps so you can get to the clarity you want, right? To get to the desire that you wish. Here's an important one. Avoid tantrums and empty venting. Venting it's not a sport. we should do it very little and in just a small measures, because it leads nowhere. So it's important that if you are really frustrated, you're really angry, think about ways in which you can act that rage by making something good happen, not just act it out. Think about a constructive way that you can make something good happen out of that anger or frustration. And if you're feeling challenged by Mars in your life, you're feeling like you're not in a good relationship, you got to ask yourself, what did this situation, what did this want to be before it got toxic due to being suppressed or repressed? Whatever it is, it probably wanted to be something else. And so that's a good reflection, a good journaling question. If you're feeling especially frustrated about something, right now in your life. And that is that. So this is a really short overview of the archetype of Mars. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to find out more about my work, sign up for my newsletter. Just visit my website, evanessacuto.com. All right, signing out. Bye.